Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vogt, the host and the content director here at Word on Fire. And joining us finally back in the United States is the great Bishop Barron. Bishop Barron, how you doing?
Brandon, I'm doing well. I'm glad to be home, I must say, because I've been, on the road constantly for the past several months. I've been in Europe 3 separate times in the past, 3 months? So, including a month in Rome. So it was a lot of traveling.
The first thing I wanted to ask is, how are you adjusting? I know after being gone a month, your whole body must have been attuned to Rome time. Are you at all back to California time?
Getting there. It takes me a long time. It's always easier for me for some reason going to Europe. But when I come home, I have a much tougher time. I was for a month, 8 hours off the rhythm of here. And so last night I was in my room at about 8:30 p.m., completely dead tired. Stayed awake till about 9, then woke up at about 4 this morning. So I'm like an hour off my usual rhythm, or hour and a half. I'll get there. The trouble is now I'm leaving in about 4 days for Baltimore, which is 3 hours off my schedule here. So my poor body has no idea, where it is.
Well, part of the difficulty was this long transatlantic flight from Rome all the way back to, or from Rome to Frankfurt, I think you went, and then all the way back to California. And when you were on that flight, you read a book that I want to devote our episode to today. It's one that I also read. It was written by Stephen Hawking, the great physicist and cosmologist. I'm holding up here for those watching this on the YouTube video. The book is titled Brief Answers to the Big Questions, and it made a big splash when it was released. I think it got up to number 4 or 5 best-selling books in the entire country. It was written kind of as Stephen Hawking was dying. He passed away back in March of this year, and I think it was sort of finished up by some of his peers and colleagues. But the book, again, has made an enormous splash, in no small part because of the first chapter, which is titled, Is There a God? So he addresses several of these big existential and scientific questions in the book. And that chapter is the one that I want to focus on here. So maybe, Bishop, let's start off, first of all, with the question, who is Stephen Hawking and why is he still important?
Well, when I was coming of age, the standard answer to the question, who's the smartest man in the world, would have been like Albert Einstein, And I think in more recent years, if you ask that question to most people, they'd say Stephen Hawking. So he was known as the greatest scientist in the world. And I think what made his story so much more compelling is that from the time he was, I think, 20 years old, he was stricken with Lou Gehrig's disease and struggled with it, for many, many decades, which is relatively unusual. And I think, everyone admired him for his courage in the face of that disease, and then for his extraordinary achievements in theoretical physics. And the beauty of someone who is very confined by the limitation of his own body, and lived in a wheelchair, and then the last many years of his life couldn't speak without the aid of a machine. I think people were so intrigued by the contrast with this mind that went soaring through the whole cosmos and searching out its deepest secrets. So, of course, he was an intriguing figure. It's plain, too, in this book, that, as you say, was finished by some of his great friends, that he had a great gift for friendship and had a sort of a wicked sense of humor. So he was a very attractive personality as well as a great mind. But I think it's fair to say the greatest theoretical physicist since Einstein. Buried, his ashes were interred in Westminster Abbey alongside of those of Isaac Newton. So, he ranks with the very greatest of cosmologists and theoretical physicists.
Near the end of his life, I'd say maybe the last 12, 24 months of his life, he was speaking pretty often about God. Every now and then you'd see an article on one of the major news sites with Stephen Hawking's latest proclamation about God or meaning or religion or something like that. So it was clearly a topic that was haunting him as he was reaching his final days. What did you think? What were your initial impressions when you picked up and read this latest book? I want to get down to the nitty gritty on that chapter on God, but what were your initial impressions?
Well, I've been reading him a lot in the last several years around this question, and I've, seen him on television programs and so on. So I wasn't too surprised by his claim that, there is no God. Maybe a little bit surprising was the confidence with which he laid it out in this book, that it's like, it wasn't really an agnostic position. It was a pretty thoroughgoing atheist position that there's no possibility of God. So I wasn't totally surprised by it, though I was very chagrined by it, as we'll discuss, because I not because his arguments are that good. They're not, in my judgment. But I just don't like this the PR of it, if you want. That for a lot of people, especially young people who aren't well versed in philosophy, hey, the smartest man in the world says there's no God. So that had, I think, a really negative impact. So I wasn't surprised, but I was kind of chagrined by how confidently he laid out this position.
Okay, well, let's look through sort of section by section in this short chapter, Is There a God?
Yeah.
And I want to get your reaction to some of his main points and arguments. Again, the book is titled Brief Answers to the Big Questions. So chapter 1, Is There a God? This is how he begins the chapter. Science is increasingly answering questions that used to be the province of religion. Religion was an early attempt to answer the questions that we all ask. But nowadays, science provides better and more consistent answers, but people will always cling to religion because it gives them comfort and they do not trust or understand science.
Oh, I mean, we're off to a really bad start. I mean, when I read that, I think the reaction I just gave you now is what I did on the plane when I read that sentence. It's dripping with the worst of arrogant scientism. Now, I've articulated this many times, both in speech and in writing. The Catholic Church at its best has nothing against the sciences, but we stand to thwart scientism, which is the reduction of all knowledge to the scientific form of knowledge. And it's something that is just endemic in so many scientists in the modern period. They're so impressed, legitimately so, by the success of the physical sciences in their proper realm that they tend then to go over the top. When I was a young man, the great example of this was Carl Sagan and his book and film series Cosmos, at the end of which Carl Sagan, I remember, delivers himself of this sort of poetic encomium to the sciences. And, there's nothing the sciences can't articulate, nothing they can't explain. I mean, it's just breathtaking in its arrogance. And see, what Hawking is doing there is a standard modern approach. Namely that, poor religion, God bless it. It was an early primitive attempt to answer scientific questions. Why is there thunder? Why is there lightning? Why does the sun come up? And, the gods did it. It's a sort of deeply condescending approach to religion. Now, I mean, can you show anthropologically that there's some overlap between primitive forms of religion and what we now consider scientific questions? Sure. But anyone that's the least bit attentive to religion in its more mature, sophisticated forms realizes religion is not asking and answering scientific questions in a primitive way. It's asking and answering qualitatively different types of questions. Now, see, I'd first of all broaden it out to include philosophy. So before we even get to religion, let's stay with philosophy for a second. Because there are people who, like Hawking, will say the same thing of philosophy. Well, isn't that nice? Back in the ancient times, people like, Anaximander and Anaximenes and Parmenides and Pythagoras and Plato and company were, poor things, trying their best to answer scientific questions. But they were doing it in this ham-handed, primitive way. Well, come on. Anyone that reads Plato, certainly, or Aristotle seriously, Aristotle indeed does engage in what we call scientific analysis, and he can be claimed legitimately as one of the great fathers of the sciences, sure. But in his properly philosophical work, think of the ethics, the metaphysics, etc., the De Anima, he's not dealing with science. He's dealing with qualitatively different types of questions. Call them properly philosophical questions. So what Hawking is doing there is something that's really, I think, reprehensible, really. It's a sort of condescending back of the hand dismissal of non-scientific questions as, just not really legitimate because they're primitive science. No, they're qualitatively different types of questions and answers. And making that distinction, I think, is something that's fundamentally important in this conversation.
So moving on, Hawking seems to suggest that really the only reason to believe in God is if you think he's necessary to explain the universe, that God would have been the only possible cause of the universe. And so the rest of the chapter aims to show why the universe could have been created without God. So Hawking says explicitly, I think the universe was spontaneously created out of nothing according to the laws of science. And then he later says, the laws of nature itself tell us that not only could the universe have popped into existence without any assistance, like a proton, and have required nothing in terms of energy, but also that it is possible that nothing caused the Big Bang. Nothing. What's your take on that analysis?
I think it's just so much nonsense. I mean, and he's doing there what a lot of his acolytes do, which is equivocate on the term nothing. I know it seems odd to put it that way because, nothing is nothing, huh? But they really are. They're equivocating on the meaning of the term. So let's stay within the philosophical framework. Within philosophy, nothing designates absolute non-being, right? The absolute negation of being of any kind. But when the theoretical physicists use the word nothing, they're using it in a highly equivocal way. They are not intending by that word absolute metaphysical non-being. They're talking about really a very rich and fecund field of energy out of which these subatomic particles emerge. See, because the minute you say what they came from and what they return to, you're not designating nothing. You're not designating absolute metaphysical non-being. You're pointing to this very richly textured field out of which these energies appear. And so it's throwing the word nothing around as though it's solving a metaphysical problem. What they mean by it is not like a measurable thing. So you might be pointing to a dimension of reality which is not a measurable thing in the conventional sense. Okay, if by that you mean nothing, fine. But see, what they in fact are indicating is a contingent state of affairs that therefore needs to be explained metaphysically. We still can ask the question, what's the condition for the possibility of that state of affairs? Now, in the thing that you read, the passage, when I read that in the plane, I remember I laughed out loud because so the universe comes out of absolute non-being, but then what? Given the laws of nature. I mean, say what you want about the laws of nature. They're not nothing. The laws of nature are naming certain fundamental constants that the scientists are operating out of. That's the epistemological context in which scientists are operating. Well, say what you want about those. They're not absolute non-being. So then the question arises, well, how do you explain the laws of nature? Which I think actually is a very searching question. Look, all the sciences are predicated upon the assumption that there's a fundamental intelligibility about being. And laws of nature is just a way of saying that, right? There's an intelligible structure to reality at the ordinary level of our experience and at the most fundamental levels of theoretical physics. And Hawking is calling those, for sake of argument, the laws of nature. I want to know where those come from. I want to know how it's just the case that reality is explicable in terms of densely complex mathematical intelligibilities. And all the sciences assume it. They don't prove it. They assume it. They rest upon it. Where did those come from? I want to know that. And don't play the game of saying, oh, it's coming from nothing. It just comes out of absolute non-being. Oh, and of course, conditioned by the laws of nature. I mean, philosophically speaking, you're just trading a nonsense there. I think I know what he means in terms of his own theoretical physics when he says that. But philosophically speaking, or then a fortiori, religiously speaking, it's just a lot of incoherence.
One thing that struck me when I read those passages was how he seems not to understand that the laws of nature have no power in themselves to cause anything. And so, for example, he writes this line. He says, I prefer to think that everything can be explained by the laws of nature. They govern everything that is going on. Now, in one sense, if he kind of just means everything tends to follow the laws of nature, then that makes sense. But the laws themselves are causally inert, so they can't bring a universe into being. They're descriptive, not prescriptive.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, they're the constants that we recognize as we analyze the way being behaves in terms of nature. What's actually is very helpful here again is old Aristotle, because Aristotle speaks of physics, and by physics he means the study of matter and motion, right? But then he speaks of metaphysics, what goes beyond the physics. And one of the problems if you want to put it in Aristotelian terms, is the tendency today to reduce the metaphysical to the physical, as though the physicist, now I'll use our contemporary sense of that term, the physicist can explain all of reality. But see, the really interesting question, Brandon, is what's the nature of being qua being? What does it mean to say something exists? So not its features that can be determined empirically and through measurement experimentation. That's the domain properly of the sciences. But what makes something to be as such? Or do Leibniz's and Heidegger's question, why is there something rather than nothing? See, as far as I'm concerned, Hawking and company aren't helping us in any way to answer that question. They're properly operating within a theoretical physics standpoint. And you'll come up with statements like that. Well, the laws of nature are fundamental, and the subatomic particles come up out of this fluctuating vacuum or this primordial field of energy. Okay, fine. I have no quarrel with any of that. That's the domain of theoretical physics. But it leaves unanswered the question, why should there be such things at all? Why should there be something rather than nothing, is the way Leibniz and Heidegger put it. That remains a valid metaphysical question. And see, I don't want to be bullied by the physicist into not asking that question. No, I'm going to stand my ground and say, no, that's still a valid question that has to be answered. But the thing is, you, qua theoretical physicist, can't answer that question. You've got to get out of the cave, Plato's cave, and move to a higher level of epistemological consciousness.
In the prologue to the book, Stephen Hawking traces some of the touch points between religion and science, in particular regards to the universe and its length of existence. So he said, in decades past, most scientists believed the universe existed eternally in the past, and some of that was to avoid a beginning moment, which would imply a creator. But he says, in recent years, the almost universal consensus is that both space and time had a beginning at the Big Bang. And interestingly, I'm sure you picked this up too, he doesn't mention that the Big Bang theory was first proposed by Father George Lemaitre, a Catholic priest. That was mysterious by his absence. But he says that the reason why he doesn't believe in God is because if time began at the moment of the Big Bang, then, and I'm quoting here, this means there is no possibility of a creator because there is no time for a creator to have existed in. What do you make of that?
I wish you'd go back to Augustine. I mean, that's a classic question in philosophy. And the philosophers have entertained that for a long time. Thomas Aquinas speaks about it because Thomas knows exactly that point. If creatio is really ex nihilo, right, creation from nothing, then it's not a change, Aquinas says, because a change happens within space and time. So there's one state of affairs and undergoes a reduction from potency to act within that state of affairs. So we can measure it temporally and so on. So Aquinas knows that whatever we're talking about when we say creation is not a temporal event, because he himself knew, read it in the 13th century, that there's no time prior to the commencement of creation. So there's nothing puzzling at all about that. And see, causality, as Aquinas knew, and so did Augustine, so did all classical philosophy, causality as such is not tied to temporality. Now, our normal sense of creation is tied to temporality because that's what we, here's this thing. Now I pick it up, I move it here. It's from this time to that time. Sure. But causality is not in itself tied to temporality. So God gives rise to the whole of the universe, but it's not a temporal event. We still have to ask the question, what's the condition for the possibility of a contingent event, whether it's a temporal event or not? See? So his observation is a valid one, but has no bearing whatsoever on the legitimacy of the metaphysical claim of causality.
It also seems like he's kind of stuck in a place that a lot of scientists are, where they have this anthropomorphic conception of God as a being within time and who must operate on the sort of same ontological playing field as the rest of us. And so he just can't expand the horizon of his view of God to just being something outside of time.
Yeah. There's something in there, I can't find it right away, Brandon, but where he does describe the sort of human-like, being who operates alongside of, and I'm like, no, but that's not what God is. And all of our great thinkers go right back to the very beginning of Christian philosophy. Nobody makes that argument that God is a conditioned being among many. And so that's again a scientistic sort of misunderstanding of the nature of God.
Bishop, we've done several different podcasts on many of these popular scientists, from Stephen Hawking to Bill Nye to Neil deGrasse Tyson, Lawrence Krauss. It seems like the same story repeated book after book after book. I'm wondering what your advice would be on how we can solve this dilemma of scientists not being really at all well-versed in philosophy. Do you think, for example, that science majors and undergraduate programs should be required to take philosophy?
Yeah, I know I do. And I think you're putting your finger, Brandon, on something important, that the breakdown of the humanities has had a really deleterious effect. If all people know are like business and science, right? So science articulates the nature of reality, and then business shows me how I kind of make my way in the world practically. If that's all you've got, you're living right in the heart of Plato's cave, and you've come nowhere out to higher dimensions of reality. And the breakdown of the humanities is one of the problems there. The fact that even our brightest people don't have an acquaintance with philosophy is a problem. Go back now, like to John Henry Newman's time, when he was talking about a liberal education. And he would have meant someone that has a really broad sense of the whole range of the intellectual disciplines. The sciences, yes. I mean, I want everyone to have a keen sense of the sciences. I want young Catholics studying science at the highest level. But I also want them in dialogue with the deeper and higher questions of philosophy and religion, and also the ways that truth is mediated through non-scientific forms, like literature and drama and art and poetry and architecture, which are not just diverting, but they're truth-bearing. I think the loss of all that has, in fact, contributed to this reductive scientism, which has sadly infected the minds of a lot of our younger people. So yeah, I quite agree with you on that.
So again, the book we've been discussing is titled Brief Answers to the Big Questions. It was Stephen Hawking's last book that he wrote before he died. The first question on is there a God, a little shaky, but the rest of the book, I think you'd agree, Bishop, was pretty interesting. He talks about time travel, black holes, alien life.
I read it on the plane. I had this infinitely long trip home from Rome. It was like a 12-hour flight. So you had given me the book when you came to Rome, and so I read not every word, but I read most of it on the plane. I liked it. I think he's a kind of a winning personality, obviously a brilliant guy, and time travel and space travel. I mean, all these things he speculates about. Sure, interesting. But the trouble is, the book, it left a bad taste in my mouth because it gets off on such a bad footing. Is somehow we have to get this God thing off the table before we can really get to the interesting stuff. And I'm like, no. Why don't you, Stephen Hawking, qua physicist, forget about God for a while? Leave that to other people. Talk about what you really know. I think that would be a better book. But his reputation is such that he'll have an impact that I think in this regard is unfortunate.
Well, it's time now for our regular question from one of our listeners. If you have a question, we would love to hear it. Just visit askbishopbarron.com and you can record your question on any device. Today we have a great question from Elizabeth in Atlanta, Georgia, who's asking about a famous quote coming from Karl Marx. So here's Elizabeth's question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Elizabeth from Atlanta, Georgia, and my question is, what are your thoughts on Karl Marx's famous quotation, "Religion is the opiate of the masses"? Thank you.
Okay, good. Karl Marx. When I was a young kid at Catholic University, I did my master's thesis on Marx. And it was because I had read so much Aquinas in the classical tradition. I wanted to get to know this other strain of thought coming from Hegel, and then after Marx, so many important people. I thought it'd be good to know him. So I wrote my first really lengthy piece, about 75 pages, on Marx's philosophy of man. And so, I know his system pretty well. And within the confines of Marx's system, that statement makes perfect sense. I mean, because he thought the first critique would be the critique of religion. So his master, Ludwig Feuerbach, who said that religion is simply a projection of our idealized self-understanding. And so the first step, Feuerbach thought, was to get up off of our knees and realize we've invented this fantasy of God, and then get to work, make the world a better place. So Marx followed up and he said, well, okay, why do we engage in this self-defeating fantasy? And his answer was, because we're so alienated by our economic situation, we're so denied in our humanity by our capitalist system, that we invent this fantasy. And then, of course, the opium image comes from the 19th century in London, where Marx was writing. And opium dens were becoming popular at that time, where people were bringing this drug in from the Middle East, and then people were literally just whiling away their lives in this fantasy world, and that was induced by opium, right? So Marx said, that's religion, is instead of getting to work and making the world a better place and making ourselves who we can be, we kind of while away our lives with this wild fantasy about God and heaven. So within Marx's system, yeah, it makes perfect sense, that line. The trouble is Marx's system is all off kilter, I mean, does it function that way sometimes for certain people? Sure, I'll grant you that. Sometimes people misuse religion in just that way. But, here's a quick answer to it. Think of Jesus on the cross when they lifted the equivalent of opium up to his mouth. So the wine was not just to quench his thirst, but they think it was kind of a drugged wine that was meant to ease the suffering, right, of the cross. And Jesus refuses it. That's a telling little icon. Is authentic religion an attempt to run away from the suffering of the world? Well, maybe some religions are, but Christianity sure ain't, right? We hold up precisely God's entry into deep injustice, deep cruelty, deep hatred, pain, all the negativity of life. God doesn't encourage us to run away from it in a fantasy world. Rather, God in Christ goes into it, fights it and transforms it through his merciful love, and then invites us to get on board this great mission called the kingdom of God, so that we can, through the divine love, also fight the deep injustice of the world. So I would say Marx, within his own system, that statement makes sense. And it might be a legitimate critique of some forms of errant religiosity, but it sure is not a legitimate critique of authentic Christianity.
Well, thanks so much for that question, Elizabeth, and thank you, Bishop Barron, for spending this time with us. Listen, Advent is right around the corner. It begins on December 2nd, and we have something special to help you from Word on Fire. You can get a free Advent Reflections booklet from Bishop Barron. All you do is cover the shipping, and it contains not only the gospel readings and reflections from Bishop Barron, but also special journaling pages and a free DVD. So just go to wordonfireshow.com/Advent to get yours today. Well, thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire Show.